Everybody, starting the live stream now. Apologize for the slightly low camera quality. This is due to me urgently needing a new one and it not having arrived yet. So if you can bear with the blurriness, we'll be okay. I swear it's not a sabotage plot by various different state agencies. Be starting on the main agenda in just a moment. What we'll be looking at is, of course, situation in Ukraine, starting off with the latest military updates, such as it can be obtained via people who are non-propagandists. Then I'm going to be looking at the comments from Victoria Nuland and others in the US state structure regarding the potential presence of biolabs in Ukraine, biological research facilities, allegedly biological weapons research facilities. And a very interesting interview that I watched today done by Dan Cohen with the Bulgarian Liana Gieva, regarding the presence of US bioweapons facilities in various different countries across the former USSR and in other places as well. So going to take a look at that. Then going to have a couple of questions that have come in on Twitter and do some stuff with that as well. If you got any other questions, put them in the chat. We'll be starting in just a moment. All right, we'll get underway, and hopefully by tomorrow the new webcam will have shown up, and so I can be slightly clearer in picture form. So, hello, Movie Maker Joe. Hello, Chris Morlock in the chat. Nazis should be known and revealed for what they are. Yeah, obviously. Well, that should be obvious, but apparently it's not. Given the desperate bid to hide the nature of the various characters involved in the Ukrainian state structure, all of whom trace a direct line of descent from Stepan Bandera's movement in World War II. All the Russian sources I follow on Twitter are being censored, says Chris Morlock. Yeah, not a surprise. Basically, they want to achieve two things. They want to make it look as if Ukrainians are winning, which they're not, and they want to make it look as if like Russia, which it's not. Both of those things are fairly obvious lies when you dig into it. Even independent American analysts will tell you that, Bill Roggio likes the likes of Scott Ritter, who maybe is a little bit more partisan in the sense that he loathes the American government, but it's a clear military analysis that what's happening at the moment is that the bulk of the Ukrainian military forces in the east of Ukraine are being slowly surrounded by the Russian armed forces. The Russians have almost completely surrounded Kiev. There is still a way in and out of it by the looks of the most recent maps that have been put out there. And the aim of the Russians is to slowly encircle the bulk of the Ukrainian armed forces in the east, and then basically offer them the opportunity of surrender or death. So that's the reality. You can see that on the maps that are published by the more independent analysts, and especially the place to follow, like the Russian sources, isn't Twitter, it's Telegram. That's the best place to go for it if you're looking for up to the minute the Russian perspectives on it, some of whom are obviously more partisan, some of whom are a little bit more independent. But from whatever way you look at it, the idea that the Russians are losing, they're falling apart, it's all going horribly badly, just isn't true. Ritter, in an interview with Lee Camp recently, made the correct observation that, if anything, the Russian armed forces, probably under the political direction of the Kremlin, is or are like foregoing their greatest advantage, which is a massive advantage in artillery, and are slowly advancing in a way that actually goes around and surrounds cities and major urban areas so as not to get bogged down, surrounding the Ukrainian armed forces, and keep pausing to offer new talks, keep pausing to offer them the opportunity, offer the Ukrainian army the chance to give up and go home, basically. All People Unite says it's pretty shocking seeing every day in the US they're given the vague impression that Russian forces will be pushed out or stopped in their tracks. Yeah, which just simply isn't true. I mean, the reason why it has to be a vague impression is that it wouldn't stand up to more than 10 minutes of scrutiny. Like Bill Roggio said today, probably accurately, that really what's happening is that the Russians are going slow. They're going slow for political reasons, which is that they clearly want to avoid the spectacle of mass civilian casualties that would be caused by them deploying their full advantage in heavy weaponry. But they are still killing the Ukrainians at a rate of 6-1, and are surrounding a lot of the major cities in the east. They're pushing all the way along the Black Sea coast, and they've got Kiev surrounded. Like whatever way, and we're like, what, 2 weeks into this? Like, there's no way for the Ukrainians to actually win in the conventional sense. A fact that is admitted tacitly by the United States government when it says that it won't deploy its armed forces into Ukraine no matter what, and that it will look to essentially fuel an insurgency. And if you look at the weapons deliveries and the way that the messaging is done, two things become obvious. Firstly, that they are looking to deliver weapons not designed to defeat the Russian army in the field. They are there to fuel an insurgency after the Russians have completed the military aspects of the operation. And they are there to create destabilization operations or help destabilization operations after the Ukrainian armed forces have been defeated. So the Ukrainians have been hung out to dry. There's no way that they are not going to win this war without NATO intervention, and NATO intervention via a conventional sense is not coming. All the noise that you get from Joe Biden, from tittering buffoon Kamala Harris, from Boris Johnson, it's all just, and Liz Truss, is all just noise. It's noise designed to do two things. One, whenever Zelensky says, well, maybe we could negotiate, what you'll see is somebody in the British or American governments, maybe probably both, will then make some gesture which strengthens the hand of the most hardline elements inside the Kiev regime. So like Zelensky said recently, well, we need to have a full discussion with the Russians. This was at the beginning of the week. This was Monday. Then somebody inside the American command structure told the Poles, well, maybe you could give Ukraine jets. And then the Poles said, well, maybe we'll make all of our old MiGs that were there from back in the Warsaw Pact era, well, maybe we'll give them to the Ukrainians. The Russians said, well, if you do that, we'll shoot it down and consider that the airfields they launched from to be taking hostile action against us, meaning the Poles have a giant target on. So then the Poles sort of paused, and the Americans said, "Oh well, we won't do that." So that might just be, complete blithering incompetence from the NATO commanders, or it might be Zelensky was making to get a no-fly zone, which again isn't going to happen. And so the American politicians felt the need to do something. And so they told the Poles, well, tell the Ukrainians they can have your old MiGs. They told the Bulgarians, tell the Ukrainians they can have your old MiGs as well, which, by the way, the Russians will know exactly how to counter and will blow out of the sky. But it's a gesture, and what it's designed to do is to strengthen the hand of the hardliners in Kiev and make sure that the Ukrainian army stays in the field, keeping this part of the war going as long as possible, as long as they can, and ensuring that the Americans have more time to prepare for whatever insurgency comes next. So this has been completely fucked. The Ukrainian government is going to be defeated and the Ukrainian armed forces destroyed. The Americans know this. The Russians are grinding out a victory. The question is not whether Ukraine will form, because it will not. The question is what happens next. How much do the Russians take of Ukraine? What do they do with it? Do they try and put it into independent states? How much do they try to hold? And what happens with the west of Ukraine, where the bourgeois nationalists in C-14, Azov Battalion, etc., actually have their base, the old Galicia? What do they do with that, if anything? Do they take all of the Black Sea coast? The question is not now when it ends. The question is how it ends, and the question is what situation with the balance of forces is there at the end of it. So what have we got in the comments? Destabilization and chaos, says Movie Maker Joe. Yeah. Chris Morlock asked, do you have an idea of how much of the CIA preparation of the Ukraine military and paramilitary focused on insurgency after an invasion? According to latest reports from people who seem to have sources in the Department of Defense, as from November or December last year, the preparations inside the American government were not for defense of Ukraine, it's for insurgency after the end of a conventional war. They are not going to risk a shooting war with the Russians over Ukraine. It's just not going to happen. No matter what some moronic politician said in Congress, most of this is just like insane virtue signaling. The Americans are not going to go to war inside Ukraine. They are going to fund an insurgency, which is what their preferred method of doing these things is, to create as much chaos as possible and try and damage the Russians in that way. I don't think that'll work. I don't think their aim of overthrowing Putin is going to work. They'll probably cause a lot of casualties, but their aim will be to try and bleed the Russian occupation. What they seem to have forgotten is that the Russian state, if nothing else, does have a very effective state security service, and also does have practice with pacifying, very brutally, an insurgency inside Chechnya, and doing so in a way that actually brought some of their enemies, in the form of Kadyrov and his men, on board to run the new state in Chechnya. And this is what they may well try and do in Ukraine. They'll find some people inside the Ukrainian state structure when the Ukrainian armed forces have been defeated, and they will then make them an offer. You can either come and run Ukraine for us, or you can die. Basically, that'll be a choice, and some of them will take the choice of going back and serving at the behest of Moscow. This is the way it's always worked. Right, so Shadowbound Refugee, hello to you. US and Russia both win regardless. People of Ukraine lose either way. Yes. Should have been that should be obvious, but quite a lot of people have forgotten that. And I will be commenting on the idea of the so-called multipolar world later on as well. Francis Valentine Gaurikai says one of the outcomes of the Cold War was the liberation of many countries in Africa. Does the current conflict provide some opportunities for real independence in Africa? Well, one of the outcomes of World War II was the weakening to the point of collapse of the British and the French empire in Africa in particular. Anti-colonial revolutionary movements in Algeria, for instance, militarily and politically defeated the French, caused a collapse of the French Fourth Republic and the military coup which brought de Gaulle to power. There was a very strong move towards national liberation, but unfortunately, this got derailed in the 70s and into the 80s with various political failures and also a vicious counter-revolution waged by the US and the British and the French, people like Thomas Sankara being assassinated, various revolutions getting derailed. Clearly, the Africa as a continent, from its northernmost part to its southernmost part, needs a liberation movement. And I mean, I'm taking it that, Francis, you're asking the question from maybe a Pan-Africanist perspective. I mean, I don't know a great deal about Pan-Africanism. I've done some reading on it. I mean, the idea that any country in Africa could be truly liberated inside the borders drawn by colonial administrators, I think has been proven to be wrong. Certainly, to actually obtain freedom, some deliberation from imperialism of any kind, it would need to have several of the larger countries in Africa would need to combine together in some kind of federation to get out of under the thumb of imperialism. And I certainly don't think that you're going to get any African nation is going to find that the Chinese, the Russians, or anybody else is going to be particularly better masters than the Americans or the British. Just look at what the Chinese are doing in East Africa. Just look at what they've done in Zambia, shooting miners, getting the Zambian legal system to defend their pit managers who abuse workers. Imperialism is as imperialism does, like no matter what the intentions are of whoever or what flag stands behind it. Right, so US loves to outsource military operations included. Yes, and we'll come to more of that with regards to the biolab operation. Chris Morlock, not just Azov, it includes Dnipro, Idar, and Dnieper and Donbass battalions. Scott very recently alluded to the expansion of these into brigades. I count initially 6,000 personnel. Yeah, they've vastly expanded the ideologically motivated bourgeois nationalist element in the armed forces because those are the best organized and most reliable fighters. And the Ukrainian conscripts in 2014 in the East either defected to the Russians or went home. And so the Ukrainian oligarchy wanted to avoid that. So they've made sure that they've beefed up, well-armed and well-trained these bourgeois nationalists, these banderists have been trained by NATO soldiers, British and Americans mostly, to the highest standard they possibly can. They'll probably still get crushed militarily, but they're certainly a more formidable operation than they were. Shadowban, thank God you understand. A lot of people on this side think it's a glorious liberation by the Russian Federation. Look, Russia's a capitalist nation. This isn't some sort of USSR throwback event. Putin is a leader of a bourgeois state. It's a lesser power than the US, obviously, but it's still a capitalist state. It still has a capitalist class running it, and they have made a calculation that now is the time to increase their sphere of influence over the region they consider should be theirs. And that is what is going on. Now, you can approve of that if you want to make the argument that Putin's form of capitalism is somehow better. Go ahead and make it. I don't think it's a good argument. I think it's a very, very weak argument. It'd be like being a pan-Slavist in like 1870. Which a lot of people were, by the way, certainly in Eastern Europe, arguing that the glorious Orthodox Christian Tsar would roll through the East to disperse the Muslim Ottomans and liberate his brother Slavs from the oppression brought to them by mainly the Ottomans and others as well. And quite a number of people thought that in Eastern Europe at the time. But if you believed that the Tsar was going to free anybody or act in the interests of anybody other than the clique in the Kremlin, and you have a very, very disappointing time coming in. Look, just because the America and its British junior partner are heinous and are the more dominant imperialist bloc in the world, doesn't mean that the other capitalist powers are going to usher in something any good for the working class. Of course they're not. Just because, think back to the pre-World War I era. Tsarist Russia, which there is a direct analog with the Putin-led Russia now, was a weak power. It was, in the words of Lenin, it never exported a kopeck of capital. It focused on dominating the regions around it, as it had done since the formation of the modern Tsarist state by like Ivan. But the idea that, for instance, if this was going to lead to liberation for the peasants of Central Asia, the peasants of Central Asia fucking hated the Tsar. We're glad to get rid of him. We're delighted to get rid of him. So let's not beat around the bush here. Yes, the primary drivers of imperialism in the modern world are America and its British counterpart and their European vassals. But the idea put forward by some that somehow a world balance between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing is going to be better for the working class anyway, I reject that idea. It's foolish, it's un-Marxist, and in fact, it's counter-revolutionary. And you can say that the blame for this crisis in Ukraine lies principally with Washington. I would say that's correct. I've argued that before. But again, do not close your eyes to who the people in the Kremlin are. These aren't the descendants of Lenin. These are the descendants of Yeltsin. As I said when I played that speech from Putin last week, what happens is Russian capitalism comes back into existence in the early 1990s. It spends 10 years looting, pillaging, and destroying the old planned economy to the point where it has got all it can from the looting stage. Now it will stabilize itself, and as part of that stabilization, it needs a stronger state to be, because capitalism generates the need for a state. It generates the need for the capitalist state because of the extreme contradictions that capitalism generates. It generates, of course, the proletariat. It generates titanic amounts of class struggle. It needs the state to constrain the proletariat and to make sure the conditions for capitalist exploitation remain in place and are recreated and are maintained. That's the purpose of it. The state also parasite upon capital, which is why the capitalists are always whinging about it, but they need it. This is the contradictory nature of the state under capitalism. State under any kind of societal formation. But the Russian state is no different. It had its period of weakness when it was Wild West looting. Then it had its period of consolidation. Then it got to the point where it was strong enough to look at asserting itself. And this is where the period we are in now. This brings it into conflict with the United States and with the United States' allies, principally the British. And this is one of the manifestations of it, as was Syria. Now, you can say with some justification that the United States was in bed and using some truly heinous characters in Syria. It was in bed with Al-Qaeda. It was helping ISIS, all very true. And the Russians went in and defeated them in an efficient operation in order to preserve their ally, Bashar al-Assad, and his government led principally by the Ba'athist Party of Syria, with all of its contradictions. Again, now you can say that it's a better outcome that the Assad government survives rather than the horrendous Islamic fundamentalists. You can make that argument. Just the way that like not all forms of bourgeois rule are the same. Not all forms of capitalist rule or capitalist state are the same. But don't blind yourself to what's going on here. Russia is a capitalist state acting in the interests of its ruling class. This is not some form of glorious liberation. This is not the Soviet Union reborn. And even if some Russian soldiers like to fly the Soviet flag, let's just be real about what's going on here. Okay, where did we get to? What does the conflict say about ruling class divisions and how it operates? This is from All People Unite. Seems very murky whose interests are served on Western Russian bourgeoisie. Let's start with the United States. As I said in one of the last streams, the United States ruling class they know on some level, even though their political leadership of the American ruling class appears to be incredibly stupid at times, and some of them really are. But they do understand that the Russian Russian capitalism has stabilized itself, as it was always going to, with a country that big and that rich in resources, with the ability to sell them on the world market. It was always going to stabilize itself. And they got surprised in 2014 when Putin acted with a degree of boldness by seizing Crimea. And they've been trying to find a way to constrain a resurgent Russian capitalism ever since. And one of the ways they sought to do that by weaponizing Ukraine. Now, it was unlikely that they were going to get Ukraine into NATO, but they could turn it into an armed camp nonetheless via bilateral relationships, via just shipping loads of arms in, via getting the British and the American forces to train up the hardcore bourgeois nationalist banderist brigades. And that's what they've done. They turn Ukraine into a problem for the Kremlin, which was the idea. They were going to weaponize this. This is why they didn't want the conflict in the East to end, why 14,000 people have died since 2014, was because Washington and London were playing this game whereby they were trying to use this conflict to destabilize Putin's government. And Putin knew this, and that's why he was acting with, one of the reasons why he was acting with extreme caution about the breakaway regions. I mean, he didn't even want to back them at first. He came around to the idea that he had to because of the actions of the Americans and the British in there. And this is all about again, it comes back to the Russian capitalist class trying to secure its interests, and the British and American bourgeoisies trying to get in the way of that and create problems for what has become for them a potential rival, not on the same level as they are, but a potential problem for them nonetheless in terms of their ability to project their power. Now, bear in mind, the fact that the Russians thwarted them in Syria still really pisses them off and are looking for some payback. Now, I mentioned in a previous live stream, it's on the channel, you can go and watch it, about the fact that Ukraine's economy will be ripped apart and looted by the American ruling class. That's true. Does that mean Ukraine is absolutely crucial to the American ruling class's economic calculations? Yes and no. It's nice they think it's good for them to be able to do that extraction of profit from Ukraine, but it's not absolutely crucial for them in terms of their market share, in terms of their ability, in terms of imperialism's profits. It's a good strategic position for them to make trouble against a rival. That's what's at stake, really. Will the NATO Nazis infinitely fund destabilization? I'll come to that in a minute. Shadowban says, I'm looking at this as the lines of nation states and borders. One belt, one road runs directly through eastern Ukraine, through Crimea and the Black Sea. Yeah, the Chinese factor is in there as well. China has a series of schemes going for for trade and the export of Chinese capital all the way across Central Asia and through Russia and into Eastern Europe. The Americans really don't want that project to succeed. And again, this is part of the game. This is competing for spheres of influence, the division and redivision of the world between different and competing power blocks. That's what's going on. And the working class gets pushed into the dirt by all of the above. Will the NATO Nazis infinitely fund destabilization? Not infinitely. They will try. I mean, but bear in mind the strategic position of Ukraine, and this is why I think that their attempts to fund an indefinite insurgency there will not work as well as it has done for them in the Middle East. And they haven't won in the Middle East. They've lost in Syria, the Americans have. If you turn what is left of Ukraine after the Russians are done into a cauldron of madness and bloodletting, which the Americans will try to do, that is going to create problems for key NATO allies. It is going to create a problem for the Germans, principally, in terms of their proximity to it. It'll create problems in terms of destabilization for the Poles and the Bulgarians, and that may lead to objections. Certainly, I don't think the German ruling class wants a perpetually unstable Western Ukraine or Galicia or whatever it ends up being called, in a way that they didn't really care, for instance, if Syria was perpetually destabilized. This being a key region in Europe with a historic interest in it from Poland, Austria, and most specifically Germany, that's going to motivate various parts of the ruling classes of Europe to look at this and say, well, maybe we need to find a solution here. Maybe they'll strike some sort of bargain with the Russian ruling class to divide up a new sphere of influence. But I doubt they'll be able to run this thing as successfully as they have done in other areas, mainly because of its strategic positioning inside Europe. Shadowban says, it feels like 1914. I'm seeing American leftists and anti-imperialists pick sides in a capitalist war. This is because of I think it's because of a weakness in the domestic American political situation, to be honest, Shadowband. I think that there is, of course, class struggle going on inside the United States. It goes on constantly. But I think the weakness of the workers' movement in any country can lead, and of course, a lot of leftists and anti-imperialists seeing American imperialism as the principal contradiction in the world, and therefore its defeat is a priority. Now, don't get me wrong, American imperialism is a massive problem if you're in an oppressed country and you're going to want to take up any kind of position you can to oppose it. But again, and this is where I depart from people who see the multipolar world as some sort of way forward for workers. It's not. It's just a redivision of the world between different capitalist blocks. And that's not a solution. Building up our own power inside our own countries as a starting point is this very first part of a solution. Acting as a cheerleading squad isn't. What now for Africa, which remains conquered, depended on primary commodities and terribly disorganized, says Francis, or asks Francis rather. Look, I'm not going to pretend to give lessons on revolution to African nations. The only thing I'll say is that the working class of a country like South Africa is potentially incredibly powerful. You have a very potentially strong working class movement there. You do in some of the other nations as well, which has seen increasing levels of proletarianization. Nigerian working class is potentially very powerful. They've actually, in the last decade or so, there's been some titanic general strikes inside Nigeria. This is all where the future lies. The future lies in like various nations in Africa, the African working class stepping forward to actually struggle on its own terms. And that will mean an inevitable confrontation with the local bourgeoisie who act as agents for imperialism quite a lot of the time. And that's what needs to be, what would need to happen and will happen, because working class in any country has no choice but to struggle. And the working class in a lot of these African nations is potentially very powerful, more powerful than perhaps they even realize themselves at the moment. But if the Nigerian workers and the South African workers took concerted action in the form of general strikes and more, and there was organizations there to actually raise the political level of the workers, Africa could lead revolutions in the future, because not only is it this hugely powerful working class there in many of its countries, it's also very resource rich. There's huge potential for revolution on the African continent. Aren't the Russian, this is from Movie Maker Joe, aren't the Russian ruling class at odds with the Western liberal ruling class? Don't see the ruling class as liberals. The ruling class might have given birth to liberalism. The ruling class are the ruling class. Putin is a Russian liberal. He's liberal as he's a Russian bourgeois leader. And what's the central tenet of liberalism is like a reflection of its origins within the bourgeoisie, its origins within capitalism, which is the respect of private property rights. And Putin certainly is that. What you've got here is it isn't about liberalism versus conservatism. It's about a clash of interests between competing capitalist classes. Some of them might like to wear the garb of the Orthodox Church. Some of them might like to wave a rainbow pride flag and say that they're bombing countries for environmentalism. These are just different ways in which capitalist interests manifest themselves. It's not about liberalism versus conservatism or woke capital versus traditionalist capital. There's no such thing. There's just capital, and it'll wear whatever it needs to justify itself and gather support from the subaltern classes. Do you think that Germany, the EU, will need to re-engage with Russia economically? Asks Stephen. Yes. I think that one of the things that's been misunderstood is the fact that Germany and France went along with the sanctions on Russia, perhaps because the Americans basically gave them an ultimatum and they crumbled before it. But don't think that that's the end of the story. Germany in particular does a lot of business with Russia, and the German ruling class don't want to lose that. Olaf Scholz might be happy to throw it away, but Olaf Scholz is in an unstable coalition government. He might be gone by in a few months, in a year. Who knows? Maybe the government will collapse. Overall, I would say that the German announcement of remilitarization, if that does indeed go through, is going to create more contradictions for German capitalism than has been initially anticipated. A rearmed German bourgeoisie is a game changer, because Germany is this huge country in the middle of Europe. It is the biggest European economy. It is the most advanced one of the most advanced industrialized economies in the world. It has, in addition to that, giant financial operations. It exports a hell of a lot of capital, not just over the EU free trade area, but also all over the world every year. It is going to be, if it remilitarizes, a powerful imperialist state in its own right. Remilitarizing does change that game somewhat, in that maybe some of the German ruling class have decided that having to be dependent upon the Americans for their security isn't a good deal for them anymore. So this is going to create more instability inside Europe, going to create more problems inside the EU. Who knows what the EU is going to look like? But certainly, to answer your question, Stephen, the German ruling class will want to re-establish ties with Russia. They buy a lot of resources from Russia. They buy a lot of metals from Russia. They need that to fuel their industry. They are going to want to re-establish this. So, which is why there will be a lobby inside the German government, which is looking to carve out some sort of deal with the Russians. Who knows what that will look like, though. But yes, the pressure will be there for a return to relations, certainly. Shadowban says, Turkey's not liking the idea of a return of the Russian Empire and its Black Sea either. Yeah, they enjoy that NATO monopoly for Istanbul. At the moment, Erdogan is trying to position himself as the negotiator. Who knows what success he'll get. He's another one who's been pivoting desperately between various different points of power in the world in an attempt to carve out a bigger Turkish sphere of influence for the Turkish ruling class. Again, he's been trying to do this in Libya, to Egypt's displeasure. He's trying to do it, of course, via his puppet in Azerbaijan, Aliyev. Whereas, of course, when Armenia and Azerbaijan went to war, it wasn't Azerbaijan really that Armenia was fighting. They were fighting a NATO-commanded army, mainly commanded by the Turks, who are certainly looking to carve out their sphere of influence in that area. If the Russians seize the Black Sea coast, that's not going to be particularly good for them. James asks, does the US cutting off fossil fuels from Russia change your feelings from what you said last Red Star Radio episode? Will Russia turn off gas to Europe? No, it doesn't change my feelings on what we said on the last episode. Bear in mind that if the Russians cut off gas to Europe, yes, they can sell it elsewhere, but it takes a hit. It takes a hit where it might not need to. I think the Russians will continue to sell to Europe until either the Americans give an ultimatum to the Europeans to stop buying it, which will create a huge problem for both the Germans and the rest of the European bourgeoisie and the Americans themselves. It'll create something of a crisis in relations, or that this crisis is solved. I think the Russians will continue, and if it looks like, and I don't think this is likely, I think the only way that they would cut it off was if the NATO countries were looking to get involved directly in Ukraine militarily. that's not going to happen. So I don't see them cutting it off for now. I think a lot of Russian oil, I mean, I saw some comment from the libertarian guy, Thomas Massey, in Congress in an interview with Blumenthal, Max Blumenthal. Massey said something that was true, which is a lot of that Russian oil will end up in America anyway. It'll be sold to second and third parties and it'll end up in the United States. General ruling class getting a military is a harbinger of nothing good. Certainly not from the history, and certainly it's going to create a lot more contradictions. That's very true. Shadowban back with, I think people are seriously underestimating the fossil fuel plans in the Invest in America Act, known as the Infrastructure Bill. It holds the power to export gas. Good point. One of the reasons why the Americans wanted to squash the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is because they want to develop their own gas exporting infrastructure. I mean, a lot of the environmental crap in various different American pieces of legislation is basically just window dressing put on the fossil fuel companies. Ultimately, the green, I mean, remember that BP, British Petroleum, tried to rebrand itself as Beyond Petroleum. Which is a great piece of advertising, but doesn't mean anything really, other than the fact that they decided that green was a good way to sell stuff. Also, I'm sure all the Americans on here are glad that you're sending an additional, I think, $13 billion to the weapons industry to dump armaments into Ukraine, which will probably then end up back on the black market again and sold to various people all over the world. Great use of resources by the American government there, but it will lead to more profit, which I suppose is the point. To move on slightly to just the biolabs question, which I'm sure you've all been following. Basically, what's happened is that Victoria Nuland, this neocon inside the State Department, confirmed, not sure why she managed to blurt this out, but she did, that the Americans have been running or have an interest in or have some oversight over biological research facilities inside Ukraine. At least 11 of them have been chronicled by Bulgarian journalist Dilyana Gaitandieva. Again, go and check out the interview with her on Dan Cohen's channel. She says there's at least 11 of these which have been documented. She's got documents off the US Embassy's website before the US Embassy in Kiev took them down, confirming that these laboratories exist. The Russian military is claiming that the Americans are weaponizing everything from like insect-borne viruses to things like plague and cholera. What the reality is that again, this Bulgarian journalist has written articles about the fact that the American government is running biological research facilities in not just Ukraine, but also in Georgia and Kazakhstan. And I don't think anybody should be surprised by this. Like Nuland didn't basically confirm that they're running them in Ukraine. And now, of course, the Americans are saying, oh, the Russians, it's all propaganda. But again, this Gaitandieva, this Bulgarian journalist, she dug out the fact that the American scientists, well, patents in the name of American scientists who don't actually exist, were patenting stuff about mosquito dispersal and crop damaging bug dispersal and things like that. This is all the heinous biological weapon research stuff that they're not allowed to do, supposedly, inside the United States. So what do you do if you want to do dodgy research? Well, you do it off the books in a country where the government is in your pocket, and you can get away with doing all kinds of dangerous things and nobody notices, back home anyway, because nobody asked the question. The Department of Defense's denial wasn't a denial. They said, we are not directly engaged in, I think it was biological weapons research in Ukraine. Now, what that means is that's a very carefully crafted denial from a lawyer, because, well, first of all, what constitutes a weapon? Does a disease constitute a weapon? Well, it is if you deploy it as such. So what they're doing is clearly they've operated these Ukrainian labs, or at least they're going to claim they are, operated via the Ukrainian government or via some third party, but which are directly responsible to the accountable to the United States government, which are operating on behalf of the United States government. This is just how you do dangerous crap that you don't want to get caught doing. You either give everybody involved diplomatic immunity, which is what they've done in some areas, or you do it through third parties, through private companies. I mean, this is how outsourcing works with private companies. Why would it not be the same via governments? So clearly they have been up to something in Ukraine involving biological weapons research. Clearly they are now worried that the Russians are going to stumble upon this and use it to embarrass them. And they're clearly preparing the ground for denying it. And also, by the way, they keep saying, oh, the Russians are going to use chemical weapons. So get ready for a new PSYOP dropping pretty soon. Shadowban back again with, it's pretty horrendous. It's publicly funding pipelines to export unrefined gas to the Caribbean. Not surprised, so they can absorb those green taxes. The offloading ports tentatively were in Odessa. What's your opinion on becoming a global phenomenon? Well, I'll take your word for it, mate. So yeah, engaging kinds of like dirty shit off the books. Bear in mind also that when the American or British government say that, oh, well, we would never do dangerous research, they have done dangerous research in the past. If you look at the history of dangerous medical research forced on, for instance, prisoners, people detained in secure mental health facilities in the United States, there's a long history of people doing this right the way up to the 1990s. Full medical procedures on prisoners, all the kind of shit that they would vehemently deny doing, they have done in the past, of course. And now they've been exposed on that over many years. They just take all the most dangerous research and do it somewhere else. But believe me, that if they thought they could get away with doing it to people again inside the United States, Britain, or wherever, they would do, because this is just how the people who run the state think. They see everybody who's not in their class as being completely disposable objects. So a couple of questions that have come in from Twitter. Why did Eastern European states back Bush over Iraq? Well, as essentially a quid pro quo, I think. A lot of the Baltic states, Ukraine, others, and Georgia all backed the Bush administration over the Iraq invasion. And what they did was they did so because basically Bush or Cheney or Rice or all of them had said, well, if you back us on this, we'll make sure you get into NATO. And basically that your accession will be guaranteed. Bush did it basically as a fuck you to the Germans and the French, who had opposed, who had opposed publicly his Iraq invasion plans. Getting more of these Eastern European states involved in NATO was the idea of Bush and Cheney, that they were going to be able to perpetually outvote the Western Europeans. And of course, these Eastern European bourgeois states wanted to get in on this because they thought that this would be a security guarantee for them if the Russians tried to make any kind of play in their country. Now, quite whether it's going to turn out to be the security guarantee for them, who knows? But we'll see. Right. Rashad says, Alex, Frank, my anarchist people played on the sheriff running for mayor here, attaching a dildo to a drone and flying it into his face. Now that's quite some prank. I hope you all got away with that. The other question that's come in is like, Russia and China abstain on Libya. Now you'll recall over 10 years ago now, America managed to get a resolution through the UN Security Council, because the Russians and the Chinese didn't veto it, on setting up a no-fly zone over Libya and taking out Gaddafi. Now that wasn't in the resolution, but it was obviously where they were going with it. Russians later claimed that the Americans had lied to them over their intentions, but I don't believe the people who run the Russian state are that naive, or the people who run the Chinese state are that naive. They didn't object to that resolution, because essentially they had other irons in the fire that they were trying to bargain with the United States at the time. And it wasn't seen as being in their interest to object to this American war at the time. Libya had been in the slightly aligned, had been kind of aligned with the USSR and back in the day, but had more been in the non-aligned camp. Gaddafi had then gone over to making deals with the British and the Americans, to the point where he must have felt that they'd given up regime change plans on him, but they're always ready to take advantage of a situation that comes up. So Russians and the Chinese just didn't see it as a priority to object to it. They had other things going on. They therefore let the Americans have their way. They probably regretted it later to a degree, in the sense that the Americans turned what could turn the whole thing into a hellhole. But now you got the Russians, the Turks, the Americans all battling for influence inside Libya itself, and engaged in this perpetual warfare there. So again, powerful states act the way they do because of the interests of their ruling classes. And there's no principle involved here, of course. The only principle being what is in the class interests of the rulers there at the time. Now, All People Unite. What sort of role do media outlets and left orgs play, if any? Navarra, Jabin, DSA, Momentum. A wholly negative one. Navarra Media is this ghastly pro-Labour Party operation. Started off as this by this guy called Arab Bastani in Britain. He was a former advisor to this creature called David Miliband. He then became Arab Bastani did some sort of pseudo-alleged anarchist, but I'm not sure how many anarchists enthusiastically tell us to vote Labour. Maybe some of the anarchists in the chat can comment on that. But what it became was, from this sort of pseudo-anarchist style street protest thing that was involved in Occupy and others, it turned into a pro-Labour Party media operation, was supposedly a pro-Corbyn media operation. And then essentially now it's just a sort of soft left Labour Party talking point machine operation. Doesn't play a positive role at all. Jacobin, similar thing, but for the Democrats. DSA is just a way of funneling people into the Democratic Party, and it has been since Harrington founded it in the 70s. Momentum, basically DSA for the Labour Party, essentially. None of these things plays a good role. All of them exist just to funnel people back into bourgeois politics again. Movie Maker Joe says, Dr. Merrill, NASA testified that in 1964 UN agreements were bent and broken by the US government. How long do you think the US government can hide their bioweapons research conducted on humans? Well, maybe not for much longer. It depends how much the Russians and the Chinese know and they want to put out there. So let's see. The various biologies of Ebola being specific to ethnic biology are clear. I'm not sure about that, but look, the US and the various other powerful states have all signed treaties saying, oh, we don't do biological and chemical weapons research. They do. Undoubtedly they do. As I said before, they do it off the books and hidden away somewhere. And most journalists don't want to ask that question. Kudos to this Bulgarian journalist for being one of the few who actually has. The left is just a network of satellite institutions downstream of the major liberal parties and the foot soldiers for ascendant capital. That is exactly correct. Chinese now asking questions for the UN to take a vote on bio research. Well, depends how much they want to withdraw, how much they want to put out there into the open. Maybe this will be one of the motivating factors over maybe the US will want to now cut a deal to end this Ukraine war. Who knows if some of their dirty business is going to be brought out into the open. Certainly, everybody should be paying attention to this, because this is just one of a series of horrendous things that the United States will and the British and everybody the other powerful state will be doing under the table, and they'll be doing it on various different people. Labs distributed around the world to exploit local pathogens in situ. That's one of the allegations, certainly. Hopefully, one of the if there's a positive outcome of this rivalry intensifying between the Chinese and the Americans and the Russians is that more of this dirty stuff does come to light, and we should be prepared to politically act on it. Also, Yeah, so various other things going on inside Ukraine and elsewhere, but so much for technology being neutral. Well, it's not. Well, technology is only as good as the class that controls it. And so if the ruling class controls it, it's going to be used for nothing good. It's going to be used to further the exploitation of the working class. It's going to be used to further alienate people. It's going to be used for all kinds of social control. You know, within a lot of technology is liberatory potential, but it's only liberatory if it's under the control of the working class. It's not truly liberatory. It's at best contradictory if it's in the hands of the capitalist class. So coming up to the hour mark, where I'll call it quits for today. But do we have any further questions? Technology lands in the hands of the powerful, use it to their advantage to create more tech to further their interests and break the powerless. Yeah, that's the game. If you control the means of production, you control the means of producing these things. And if you control that, you produce things that are going to perpetuate your aims and your ability to profit. One of the Marxist arguments that I still with is that there is liberatory potential within an awful lot of technology. Even technology now is controlled by the ruling class and is used by them. There's still elements of it which the working class could put to its use in a future socialist society. Which is why I'm not a primitivist. I don't think many people actually are. Most of the primitivists I've met have been bourgeois hippies. But there's huge potential within a lot of what capitalism develops. It's just that it's turned towards further perpetuating capital's domination, that it turns into a negative. So you have the positive constantly turning into a negative, but then again, action by the working class can turn it back into a positive again. Okay. Right, going to be back tomorrow. Sorry to clarify. What role in terms of this conflict and the production of narratives and legitimation did Navarros and Jacobins play? Well, the Navarra and Jacobin are both, their general political line veers from pacifism and support for sort of woolly liberal institutions or the global international order, such as it is, like supporting the UN, supporting some kind of idealized international relations framework. But then slips over from pacifism to outright support for imperialism. So, for instance, Jen was very keen on like equivocating over Syria. I mean, my line has been for a long time now, you have to take as your starting point the major enemy is always at home. The major enemy to fight is always your own ruling class. Jacobin, Navarra, various others who take a woolly pacifistic line tend to slip into supporting imperialism very quickly. And they've done this consistently. They'll equivocate over it and say, well, then they'll say, well, something must be done about Assad. And the answer I have to that is, well, then you've forgotten the major lesson of the last 100 to 200 years, which is our major contradiction to deal with is our ruling class. You know, Syria will be dealt with by the Syrian working class ultimately. It is not our job to basically provide support to for imperialism's aims, even if imperialism dresses it up in human rights and humanitarian language. It's still imperialism. If you're supporting its actions, what you're doing is you're enabling imperialist domination of other nations and peoples. Doesn't matter what language it uses or however much you justify it to yourself. The key thing to remember, and one of the biggest mistakes of a lot of so-called Marxists in the 20th century and now into the 21st, was that because they ran into a dead end politically with the class struggle at home, they then flipped over into a misapplication of internationalism abroad. And what they started doing was they started supporting like liberal campaigns in other countries that were ultimately sponsored by the Western bourgeoisies on grounds of internationalism. It wasn't internationalism. They'd fallen in a form of supporting imperialism and opportunism. Again, these are politically difficult questions to deal with, but you have to hash them out via a proper politics. Otherwise, you end up just supporting one bourgeoisie or another. and that's maybe the central point I want people to take away from this, is that standing on the sidelines waving one national bourgeois flag or another, or supporting one capitalist bloc or another, is just ridiculous. It's not a position based on the idea that you're the position that's going to strengthen the working class domestically or internationally. Like, our imperialist bloc is better than yours is then reversed into, well, their imperialist bloc is better than ours. How's that any good? Yes, when internationalism was perverted into globalism. Yeah. The absolute monstrous ridiculous of people only arguing that NATO and the EU were internationalist organizations and not expressions of imperialism. I've seen alleged Marxists argue that. Many of them ended up working for the BBC, coincidentally. James Mora, Afghanistan. Can you ask Max Blumenthal to apologize to the congressman for his vulgar insinuations that America isn't a champion of human rights and freedom? Well, next time I speak to Max, I'll let him know that I'll say that Congressman Kana does have a step out there, and he does have his fans. Right. So that brings us to the top of the hour tonight. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. I think what we'll do tomorrow, unless there's a major development in the Ukraine crisis, I'll look at something else going on in the world, just to make sure that just because there's a lot of other shit that's going on, which of course is being under the war news constantly. So the crucial thing is to not let that blind you to other things that are going on. So check my Twitter feed and the Telegram account tomorrow, and I'll put up something else for discussion. Lavit Lawrence says, thanks, Alex. You were not kidding on the last RSR about wearing a suit during every live stream. I never jest about suit wearing. As an Englishman, you have to take these things seriously. You're seeing the very mild aspects of my suit wearing. Movie Maker Joe, thank you for your elaborate about Navarra. They are in fact garbage, nothing to say. Yeah, I can elaborate much further about Aaron Bastani if you want me to. Thanks for the stream, Alex. For source and the sanity you have. The purple on this side of the pond. Look, people lost their minds. Yeah, well, when anti-imperialism just becomes support for somebody else's capitalist bloc, then they really have lost it. Southfront website is still a mess. They got cobbled by their server. Yeah, one of the things we are going to be seeing is a sort of disintegration of the internet. Also, CFC over Man U. Is that a reference to Chelsea? Better than United. If that's an actual reference, I'm not a Man United fan. I never have been. One day I will reveal my football team of choice, but it is not today. I've got to keep the audience hanging for that one. All right. So thank you, everybody. Oswhistle says, not a lot of sanity. Rudd Star Russell Brand crossover. Well, we'll see. If Russell wants to come on the show, he's more than welcome. I very much appreciated his performance Death on the Nile. Okay, so thanks for tuning in. If anything urgent or dramatic happens tomorrow, I will update the topic of the stream. But until then, come back here for same time tomorrow, and we'll carry on the discussion. Oh, and if you have any ideas you want to see discussed, or any questions that you want to put to me to answer on the stream, either just reply to me on Twitter or put it in the Telegram channel or send me a message or something, and I'll get them tomorrow. Until then, thank you, everybody, and bon chance, as they say.